They say a horse can be broke, but a man's spirit? That's another thing entirely. It's a saying they used to mutter in the dusty streets of Copper Ridge, Montana. A phrase whispered over cheap whiskey when the talk turned to hard men and even harder situations. But on a bitter autumn morning in 1887, those words weren't just a saying, they were a prophecy. And for a lonely school teacher named Catherine Millbrook, that prophecy was about to come true in a way that would drench the forgotten frontier town in secrets, lies, and blood. The one-room schoolhouse stood on the edge of town like a final, forgotten thought. Inside, 33-year-old Catherine was erasing the day's lessons from the slate board, the chalk dust dancing in the long afternoon sun. She'd been in Copper Ridge for 5 years, a refugee from a life she no longer spoke of, a teaching certificate from Boston in one hand, a shattered heart in the other. Her fiancé back east, a man of wealth and standing, had chosen another woman, a woman with a bigger name and a fatter dowry. The shame had chased her west, to a place where no one knew her name, and no one cared. At 33, she was a spinster, a word that tasted like ash in her mouth, respected enough as the town's teacher, but pitied in the way people pity a stray dog. Heavy boots on the wooden steps broke the silence. The man who filled her doorway was so tall he had to duck to get inside. His shoulders were as wide as the doorframe itself, and he carried in stillness that was more intimidating than any noise. This was Jacob Thornfield, owner of the Double T Ranch, a man who had carved his existence out of the unforgiving Montana wilderness after the war. They said he could break a wild Mustang with a whisper and face down a grizzly with a stare. He was a ghost in his own town, a man of few words and fewer friends. His presence in her schoolhouse was as strange as a blizzard in July. "Miss Millbrook," he said. His voice was like rocks grinding together, deep and rough. He pulled off his dusty hat, revealing dark hair already shot through with silver, though he couldn't be much older than her. "Mr. Thornfield." She put down the eraser, her heart suddenly beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. What could a man like Jacob Thornfield possibly want with her? He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He stepped into the room, his gray eyes pinning her in place. They were the color of a winter storm, and they looked right through her. "I have a proposition for you," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was screaming. "I need a wife." The words just hung there in the dusty air. A wife. He said it like he was ordering a sack of flour from the general store. Catherine felt a hot blush creep up her neck, a mixture of shock and pure, uncut humiliation. I beg your pardon?" "This isn't about romance, Miss Millbrook," he said, stepping closer. His sighs seemed to suck all the air out of the small room. "It's a practical matter. Winter is coming. I can feel it in my bones. I need someone to run the house. Someone respectable." His stormy eyes swept over her, taking in her simple, worn dress, the tight bun of her hair, the exhaustion she tried so hard to hide. "And you," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "you need protection. This town isn't kind to women alone, especially when the rowdy cattlemen come through in the spring." Every word was a slap in the face. He was right, of course. That was the worst part. The whispers, the pitying looks from the other women, the leering stares from traveling men. She lived with it every day, but to have it laid bare so coldly, so clinically, it was a special kind of cruelty. "You're proposing a business arrangement," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She fought to keep it from trembling. "That's exactly what I'm proposing," he confirmed. "I'll give you my name. I'll provide for you, protect you. You'll have a home, a place in this community that no one can question. In return, you'll manage the household." He paused again, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "And you will ask no questions about my business, or my past." The final condition landed with a thud. Ask no questions. It wasn't just a marriage of convenience. It was a vow of silence. What was this man hiding? She turned away, staring out the window at the endless Montana sky. The mountains in the distance were like jagged teeth, already capped with snow. She thought of her tiny cold room at the boarding house. She thought of the lonely, empty years stretching out in front of her. Was this desperation, or was this survival? "I'll need time to consider," she said, her voice stronger now. Fair enough, he rumbled, but don't take too long. Winter waits for no one. He turned and walked out, leaving a gaping silence in his wake. Catherine sank into her chair, her body trembling. The offer was an insult wrapped in a lifeline. It was humiliating. It was cold. But as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long, lonely shadows across her empty classroom, a terrifying thought took root in her mind. This insane, insulting, mysterious proposition might be the only chance she ever had. 3 days later, Catherine stood in the faded parlor of the Copper Ridge Hotel. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke and secrets. Judge Morrison, a man whose face was a road map of whiskey veins, stood before them, looking deeply uncomfortable. This was her wedding day. She wore her best navy blue dress. Jacob stood beside her, a black-suited mountain of a man. Between them on a rickety table lay a piece of paper, the marriage contract. Word of it had already spread through Copper Ridge like a prairie fire. She could feel the eyes of the witnesses on her back. Sheriff Burke, his face impassive. Dr. Whitman looking curious. Mrs. Patterson from the hat shop, her face a mask of barely concealed gossip. They were all wondering, what kind of woman agrees to a thing like this? Jacob had explained the terms with blunt finality: mutual respect, shared responsibilities, and separate bedrooms. But there was one clause handwritten at the bottom that made her skin crawl. Article 7, the wife shall not, under any circumstances, enter the master bedroom, the study after dark, or the southern barn without the express permission of the husband. Violation of this article will be considered a breach of this contract. It was a contract of walls, of locked doors. Well, the judge cleared his throat, his eyes darting from the contract to Catherine's pale face. This is unorthodox, but if you're both willing. He gestured to the document with a trembling hand. You'll need to sign. Catherine picked up the pen. Her hand shook so violently she could barely hold it. This wasn't a wedding. It was a transaction. She was selling her name, her future, for the promise of a roof over her head. The humiliation was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Instead, it was the most shameful. She glanced at Jacob. His face was carved from stone, his gray eyes fixed on the contract. There was no warmth, no comfort, only that unnerving, watchful stillness. It was like marrying a stranger, a dangerous stranger. What was she doing? She was about to chain herself to a man who had secrets so dark he had to write them into a legal document. Her pen hovered over the paper. The silence in the room was deafening. Go on, Miss Millbrook, Sheriff Burke said, his voice smooth as oil. Sign the paper. It's for the best. There was something in his tone, an urgency, a warning. It wasn't encouragement. It was a command, and it sent a chill down her spine. Why did the sheriff care so much? She looked from the sheriff's knowing smirk to Jacob's stone-cold expression. Suddenly she felt it. A trap. The jaws of it were closing around her, right here in this dusty hotel parlor. These men. They were all connected, and she was the pawn in a game she didn't understand. Her heart screamed at her to run, to tear up the contract and flee Copper Ridge forever. But where would she go? Back to the shame of Boston? To another dusty town where the whispers would just start all over again? With a final, shuddering breath, she signed her name, Catherine Millbrook, for the last time. Jacob signed his name with a swift, brutal stroke. The ceremony was over in less than a minute. They exchanged simple gold bands as cold and impersonal as the contract itself. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob leaned down. For a terrifying second, she thought he would kiss her on the lips. Instead, his mouth brushed against her ear, his breath hot and his voice a low, threatening whisper that only she could hear. Welcome to the Double T, Mrs. Thornfield. Remember the rules, break them, and you'll regret it more than you can possibly imagine. The Double T Ranch was a kingdom of silence and secrets, sprawling across 1,500 acres of unforgiving land. The main house was huge, a two-story monument to a family that was no longer there. It was clean, but it felt empty, unlived in. Jacob showed her to her room. It was at the opposite end of the hall from his. It was large and comfortable, with a heavy oak door and a sturdy lock. A cage, she thought, a very comfortable cage. The first weeks were a strange, silent dance. They were two ghosts haunting the same house. Jacob would leave before sunrise and return after sunset, covered in dust and smelling of horse and earth. He rarely spoke more than a few words to her. "Dinner's ready," she'd say. "Thank you," he'd reply. The silence between them was a living thing, thick and suffocating. She threw herself into her work, cleaning and organizing, cooking meals he ate without comment. It was a way to keep from thinking about the locked doors, about the southern barn she was forbidden to approach, about the low, guttural sounds she sometimes heard coming from Jacob's room late at night. Nightmares. One night, a storm rolled in, shaking the very foundations of the house. Catherine lay in her bed, listening to the thunder and the howling wind. And then she heard it again, a muffled cry from Jacob's room. It wasn't a sound of fear, it was a sound of pure, raw agony. Against her better judgment, against the cold warning he had given her on their wedding day, she crept out of her room and down the dark hallway. She stood before his door, her hand raised to knock, but she hesitated. "Remember the rules." The cry came again, louder this time. The name he called out was not his. It was a single anguished word. "Elias!" Who was Elias? The question burned in her mind. She knew she should go back to her room. She knew she was playing with fire. But the mystery of this man, her husband, was a puzzle she couldn't leave alone. Her hand touched the cold brass doorknob. It wasn't locked. She turned it, slowly, silently. The door creaked open just a crack. The room was dark, lit only by a flash of lightning. Jacob was thrashing in his bed, tangled in the sheets, his face slick with sweat. In the corner of the room by the cold fireplace was a small, child-sized rocking horse, covered in a dusty sheet, and on the wall above it, she saw them. Faint, dark stains. They were almost invisible in the gloom, but another flash of lightning illuminated them for a horrifying instant. They looked like handprints, small, bloody handprints. A floorboard creaked behind her. She froze, her blood turning to ice. "I warned you, Catherine." Jacob's voice. He wasn't in the bed. He was standing right behind her in the dark hallway, his voice a low, deadly growl. She hadn't heard him get up. She hadn't heard him move. He was as silent as a predator. "I warned you about the rules." She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it would break. He stood there, a towering silhouette against the dark hall, his face hidden in shadow. The storm raged outside, but the tempest in this hallway was far more terrifying. She had broken the first rule, and the look in the shadows where his eyes should be told her she was about to find out the price. "What did you see?" His voice was flat, but the menace underneath it was sharp as a razor. "Nothing," she lied, her own voice a squeak. "I heard you cry out. I was concerned." He took a step closer, and she had to fight the urge to stumble backward. "Concern is not part of our arrangement. Your room is at the other end of the hall for a reason." He reached past her and pushed the bedroom door shut with a decisive click. The sound echoed in the silent hallway. He stared down at her, his face still cloaked in darkness. "Go back to your room," he commanded, "and do not make that mistake again." She fled. She didn't walk. She fled, scurrying back to her room and locking the door behind her. She leaned against the wood, her body trembling uncontrollably. Elias, the rocking horse, the bloody handprints. These weren't just secrets. They were pieces of a nightmare. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those small dark stains on the wall. The next morning, Jacob was gone before she woke up. An eerie silence had settled over the house, heavier than before. It was as if their confrontation in the hall had never happened. But it had. A line had been crossed. She tried to push the image from her mind, but it was burned there. She had to know. Who was Elias? What happened in that room? She decided to start in town. Under the guise of buying supplies, she went to the general store. Martha Henley, the owner's wife and the town's primary gossip, was arranging a display of canned peaches. "Good morning, Mrs. Thornfield," Martha said, her eyes gleaming with a curiosity she didn't bother to hide. Settling in all right at the Double T? It's a large house, Catherine said carefully, picking up a sack of flour. I imagine it must have been quite full once. Martha's smile tightened. Oh, it was. Before the tragedy. Catherine's heart skipped a beat. Tragedy? Oh, you don't know. Martha feigned surprise, but she was clearly thrilled to be the one to tell the story. Jacob's younger brother, Elias, such a sweet boy, died about 10 years ago. Just a child. How, how did he die? Catherine asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Martha leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It was a riding accident, out on the south pasture. Or so they say. So they say. Well, Martha shrugged, a sly look in her eyes. Accidents happen all the time on ranches. But Jacob, he was never the same after. Became cold, silent, locked himself away. Some say the guilt just ate him alive. Guilt? The word hung in the air. Why would Jacob feel guilty about an accident? It was his horse, you see, Martha added, delivering the final devastating blow. Elias took Jacob's stallion out without permission, a horse far too wild for a little boy to handle. Jacob was supposed to be watching him. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. The nightmares, the anguished cries of Elias in the night, the locked room. It all started to click into place, forming a picture of unimaginable grief and guilt. But something still felt wrong. The bloody handprints. They didn't fit with a riding accident miles away in a pasture. Her mind raced. The contract. The wife shall not enter the southern barn. The place Elias supposedly died was also forbidden. What was Jacob hiding out there? She left the store, her head spinning. On her way back to the wagon, she passed Sheriff Burke's office. He was standing outside polishing a silver badge on his chest. He tipped his hat to her. Mrs. Thornfield, he said, that same oily smile on his face. Hope your husband isn't working you too hard. Mr. Thornfield is a very private man, Catherine replied, her eyes narrowing. That he is, Burke agreed. Keeps to himself. A good thing, too. A man with a past like his. It's better to let sleeping dogs lie. It was another warning. The second one he'd given her. The whole town seemed to be warning her away from her own husband's past. But Catherine wasn't the same woman who had arrived in Copper Ridge 5 years ago. She was no longer just a jilted schoolteacher running from her past. She was Mrs. Thornfield. And the secrets of this house, of this man, were now her secrets too. She had to know what was in that southern barn. That night she waited until the house was completely still. She waited until she heard the telltale groan of Jacob's bed as he settled in for the night. Until the silence was so deep it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Then she slipped out of her room. She moved through the dark house like a wraith, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floors. She didn't take a lantern. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale, ghostly light over the ranch. The southern barn was set apart from the others, isolated at the edge of the property, bordering the dark, sprawling south pasture. As she got closer, she saw why Jacob kept it locked. The door was new, made of thick, reinforced timber, with a heavy iron padlock that looked brand new. The windows were boarded up from the inside. It wasn't a barn, it was a vault. But as she circled the building, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline, she found something. A small, high window at the back, near the roofline, had a single loose board. It was too high to reach, but there was an old water trough nearby. Her hands trembling, she dragged the heavy trough against the wall of the barn. It was a struggle, her muscles screaming in protest, but she managed. She climbed onto the edge, her fingers scrabbling for a hold on the rough wooden slats. Slowly, carefully, she pulled herself up until her eyes were level with the loose board. She peered through the gap. The inside of the barn was pitch black. She couldn't see a thing. Disappointment washed over her. It was all for nothing. She was about to climb down when she heard it, a sound from inside, a soft, rhythmic scraping noise. Scrape, 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 followed by a low, mournful moan. There was someone in there. Terror, cold and absolute, seized her. This wasn't a place of memories, it was a prison. Jacob was keeping someone locked inside this barn. Her mind reeled. Who could it be? Was this the source of his secrets? Was this why he needed a wife who would ask no questions? She had to get a better look. She pressed her face harder against the opening, trying to force the board wider. It splintered with a loud crack that sounded like a gunshot in the dead of night. She froze, listening, expecting to hear Jacob's heavy footsteps thundering toward her. But there was only silence. And then, the scraping sound from inside stopped. A new sound began, a slow, heavy shuffling. Someone was moving towards the back wall, towards her. A face appeared in the gap, pale and gaunt in the moonlight, with wild, matted hair and eyes that burned with a strange, feverish light. It was a man's face, but ravaged by time or madness. He stared right at her, his lips peeling back from yellowed teeth in a grotesque smile. "Pretty," the man rasped, his voice a dry, dusty whisper. "Are you the new one? He always brings pretty ones." Catherine's scream was a choked, silent thing trapped in her throat. She scrambled backwards, lost her footing on the slick edge of the trough, and tumbled to the ground. She landed hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She lay there gasping for breath, her mind screaming. Who was that man? What did he mean, the new one? Suddenly a shadow fell over her. She looked up into the stone-cold face of her husband. Jacob stood over her, his eyes two chips of ice in the moonlight. He wasn't angry. He was something far worse. He was utterly, terrifyingly calm. "I told you not to come here, Catherine," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Some things are better left buried." He reached down, not to help her up, but to grab her arm in a grip of iron. He hauled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. "Now," he said, his face inches from hers, his voice a low growl that vibrated through her entire body. "You're going to come with me, and I'm going to show you exactly what happens to wives who don't follow the rules." He dragged her not to the house, but to the front of the forbidden barn. His grip on her arm was like a manacle, crushing and inescapable. He produced a large iron key from his pocket and unlocked the heavy padlock. The sound of the tumblers clicking open was like a death sentence. "You wanted to know my secrets," he hissed, his voice raw with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than anger. It was grief. It was fury. It was despair. "Fine. You'll know them all." He shoved her through the door into the suffocating darkness within. The smell hit her first, a cloying mix of hay, sweat, and sickness. The door boomed shut behind her, plunging them into absolute blackness. She heard him fumbling with a match, and then the soft hiss of a lantern coming to life. The flickering yellow light pushed back the shadows, and Catherine finally saw the truth. It was worse than she could have ever imagined. The barn wasn't a prison, it was a sick room, a makeshift hospital. In the center of the large space was a simple cot, and lying on that cot, shackled by his ankle to the bed frame with a long, heavy chain, was the man she had seen in the window. But now in the lantern light, she could see him clearly. He was thin and pale, yes, but his face. His face was an almost perfect mirror of Jacob's. The same strong jaw, the same dark hair, the same gray eyes, only these were clouded with madness. "Catherine," Jacob said, his voice breaking. "This is my brother, Elias." Catherine stared, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. "Elias? But he's dead. They said he died in a riding accident." "He should have," Jacob whispered, the sound ragged and torn from his throat. He wouldn't look at his brother, staring instead at a dark stain on the floor. "The horse threw him. His head. It struck a rock. The doctor said he was gone." Jacob's whole body shuddered. "We brought him home. We were preparing him for burial when he woke up. He just sat up and started screaming. But it wasn't him anymore. The fall, it broke something in his mind. He's violent, unpredictable. He doesn't know who I am. He doesn't know who he is." The man on the cot, Elias, began to rock back and forth, humming a tuneless, discordant melody. "The pretty bird is in the cage," he sang in a high, childlike voice. "Will she sing for me?" "I couldn't send him to an asylum," Jacob continued, his voice thick with a decade of unshed tears. "They're hellholes, cages where they forget about people. I couldn't do that to him. This is his home. So I told the town he died. I held a funeral. I buried an empty casket, and I've kept him here ever since, safe. The secret was out. Not a murder, not a prisoner, but an act of desperate, heartbreaking love and protection. The locked room in the house wasn't a place of violence. It was Elias's old room, a shrine Jacob couldn't bear to change. The nightmares, the guilt. It all made a terrible, tragic sense. But one question still remained. The handprints, Catherine breathed, her eyes locking with Jacob's. In his room, the bloody handprints. Jacob's face, which had softened with grief, hardened again into a mask of pure, cold fury. He took a step toward her, the lantern light casting monstrous shadows on the walls. The accident didn't just break his mind, Jacob snarled, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. It made him talkative. He remembers things now that he'd forgotten, things he saw, the day of the accident. He wasn't just riding my horse. He paused, his eyes boring into hers, full of a darkness she had never seen before. He was running. He was running from the man who had just murdered our father. Catherine gasped. Jacob's father. She'd been told he died in a different riding accident years before Elias's. It was a lie. Another one. Who? She whispered. Who killed your father? A man who wanted our land. A man who thought a boy's testimony was worthless. Especially a boy who was half mad, Jacob said, his fists clenching at his sides. A man who still lives in this town, thinking his secret is safe. He finally looked at her, and the cold purpose in his eyes chilled her to the bone. Now you understand, he said. This isn't just a marriage of convenience. I didn't marry you for a housekeeper, Catherine. I married you for an alibi. Her blood ran cold. An alibi? Winter is coming, he said, his voice the rumble of an avalanche. And when the first big snow cuts this valley off from the rest of the world, I am going to find the man who destroyed my family, and I am going to kill him, and my loving, respectable wife. You're going to tell the sheriff I was home with you all night. The trap had sprung. She wasn't a partner. She wasn't a wife. She was a tool, an instrument in a decade-old plan for cold-blooded revenge. And she had just walked right into the middle of it. The weeks that followed were a new kind of prison. The secret of Elias was a shared weight between them, a silent, monstrous thing that lived in the barn and in the space between their words. The politeness was gone, replaced by a tense, brittle alliance. Catherine cooked and cleaned, and Jacob ate, his mind clearly miles away, plotting. She watched him. She saw him cleaning his rifle, counting his cartridges. She saw him studying maps of the valley, his finger tracing lines in the dust. He was a man possessed, driven by a ghost, and she was his accomplice. One evening, as the first flakes of snow began to drift down from a bruised purple sky, Jacob found her in the parlor, staring into the fire. It will be soon, he said, his voice quiet. He stood by the mantel, the firelight catching the hard planes of his face. Who is it, Jacob? She asked, her voice just as quiet. Who are you going to kill? He was silent for a long moment, watching the snow fall outside the window. Ezra Blackwood, he finally said. The name was familiar. Blackwood owned the sprawling ranch to the north. He was a powerful, feared man, rich, ruthless, and untouchable. Blackwood wanted the water rights to the creek that runs through our south pasture, Jacob explained, his voice a low monotone, as if reciting a history he had memorized through 1,000 sleepless nights. My father refused to sell. The day he died, he was supposed to be meeting Blackwood out there. Blackwood claimed my father never showed up, said he must have been thrown from his horse on the way. He turned from the window, his eyes burning with a cold fire. Elias was hiding in the trees, playing. He saw it all. He saw them argue. He saw Blackwood strike our father with a rock from the creek bed. He saw him place my father's foot in the stirrup and spook the horse. Catherine felt a wave of nausea. And no one believed him? He was a child, Jacob said bitterly, and after the accident that shattered his mind, his story became the ravings of a madman. Blackwood has owned this valley ever since. He owns the judge. He owns the sheriff. Sheriff Burke, his oily smile. his warnings to let sleeping dogs lie. He wasn't just aware of the secret, he was part of the cover-up. The entire town was built on a foundation of murder and lies. "This is madness, Jacob," she pleaded. "You can't just kill him. It will destroy you. It will destroy what's left of your family." "Justice was buried with my father 10 years ago," he shot back, his voice like cracking ice. "All that's left is vengeance, and I will have it." The snow fell harder, thicker, a white curtain descending on the valley, cutting them off, isolating them. The stage was set. A few days later, the storm was a full-blown blizzard. The world outside was a howling whiteness. Jacob came into the kitchen where she was kneading bread, his face set like granite. He was wearing a heavy sheepskin coat and carrying his rifle. It was time. "If anyone comes asking," he said, his gray eyes locking onto hers, "I was here. We spent the evening reading by the fire. Do you understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "Good," he said. He turned to leave, but then he hesitated at the door. He looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than vengeance in his eyes, a flash of doubt, of regret. "Catherine," he started, then shook his head. "Just stay inside. Lock the doors." He stepped out into the storm, and the howling wind swallowed him whole. She was alone. Alone with a murderer's secret and a madman in the barn. She locked the door, her hands trembling. She was an accomplice now, in fact as well as in name. Her future, her very life, was tied to the actions of a man walking into a blizzard to commit murder. Hours passed. The storm raged. She paced the floor, the silence of the house a roaring in her ears. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like the sheriff at the door. Around midnight, she heard a noise from outside. Not the wind. A frantic, rhythmic banging. It was coming from the southern barn. Elias. She grabbed a heavy shawl and a lantern, her heart pounding. The storm was a physical force, trying to tear the lantern from her hand. The snow was already knee-deep, the drifts piling up against the house and barn. She fought her way to the barn, the wind screaming in her ears. The banging was getting more desperate. She fumbled with the frozen lock, her fingers numb. Finally it gave way, and she stumbled inside. Elias was not on his cot. He was standing by the door, his eyes wide with a strange, lucid terror. The shackle on his ankle had been smashed open with a piece of rock. He had broken free. "He's coming," Elias whispered, grabbing her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "The bad man is coming. Not for Jacob. For me. He knows I remember." "What are you talking about, Elias?" Catherine cried, trying to pull her arm free. "Jacob went after Blackwood." "No!" Elias shrieked, his eyes wild. "Not Blackwood. It was never Blackwood. Jacob is wrong." A sudden, earth-shattering crash came from the main house, the sound of the front door splintering, being kicked in from its frame. Elias whimpered, shrinking back into the corner of the barn. "He's here. The shadow man." Before Catherine could react, the barn door was thrown open. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the swirling snow, a shotgun held ready in his hands. It wasn't Blackwood. It wasn't Jacob. It was Sheriff Burke. "Well, well," the sheriff said, his oily smile twisting into a predatory snarl. "Looks like the whole crazy family is here. This just makes my job easier." His eyes flickered past Catherine to the cowering figure of Elias. "I heard Jacob went calling on old man Blackwood tonight. A perfect distraction. Gives me a chance to finally clean up this last loose end." The truth hit Catherine like a physical blow. Jacob had the wrong man. For 10 years, his grief and anger had been aimed at the wrong target. Burke was the killer. He was the shadow man Elias had seen. He had likely used the dispute with Blackwood as a cover, killing Jacob's father himself for reasons she couldn't fathom. And now, with Jacob gone, he was here to silence the only living witness. "You won't touch him," Catherine said, stepping between the sheriff and Elias. Her body trembling, but her voice full of a resolve she didn't know she possessed. Burke laughed, a nasty, sharp sound. "Oh, I will. But you first, Mrs. Thornfield. Dead men tell no tales, and dead women. They can't be an alibi, can they?" He raised the shotgun, the two black barrels looking like twin tunnels into hell. The world slowed down. She saw the flash of metal, the tightening of his finger on the trigger. This was it. This was how it ended. In a cold barn, in a forgotten corner of Montana, killed by a man whose crimes had been buried for a decade. Then from the darkness behind her came a guttural roar of pure animal rage. Elias, who had been cowering in the corner, launched himself forward. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a force of nature, a blur of motion fueled by a lifetime of fear and a sudden primal need to protect. He slammed into Sheriff Burke like a battering ram. The shotgun discharged with a deafening boom, the blast going wide, tearing a chunk out of the barn wall. The two men crashed to the snowy ground, a tangle of limbs and desperate snarls. Catherine stood frozen for a second, her ears ringing, before her mind kicked back into gear. She grabbed the heavy iron padlock from the door, the one that had kept Elias a prisoner for so long. She ran out into the blizzard and brought it down with all her strength on the back of Sheriff Burke's head. He grunted and went limp. Elias scrambled off him, breathing in ragged, heaving gasps. He looked at Catherine, and for a fleeting moment, the madness in his eyes cleared. He looked like Jacob. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice clear and sane. And then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed in the snow. The blizzard passed, leaving behind a world of pristine, silent white. But the silence at the Double T was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting is done. Catherine had managed to drag both unconscious men into the barn, away from the deadly cold. She had tied Burke's hands and feet with rope. Elias was breathing, but shallowly, a dark bruise blooming on his temple where he must have hit his head in the fall. Jacob returned just after dawn. He looked like a ghost carved from ice, his face gaunt, his rifle hanging limply in his hand. He found her in the barn sitting between the two men, a lantern at her feet. His eyes took in the scene. The bound sheriff, his unconscious brother, the splintered doorframe of the house. "Catherine," he breathed, his voice full of disbelief. "You were wrong, Jacob," she said, her own voice hollow and exhausted. "It wasn't Blackwood. It was Burke. He came for Elias." She told him everything. The confession, the attack, Elias's moment of lucid bravery. Jacob stared at the unconscious form of Sheriff Burke, and a decade of hatred seemed to drain out of him, leaving him looking old and broken. His entire life's purpose, the vengeance that had fueled him for 10 years, had been a lie. He had been aiming his rage at a ghost, while the real monster wore a silver badge and smiled at him in the street. He knelt by his brother's side, his hand gently brushing the matted hair from Elias's forehead. "Elias," he whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." As if from a great distance, Elias's eyes fluttered open. He looked up at Jacob, and the clouds of madness were gone. The eyes that looked back were clear and full of a deep, heartbreaking sadness. "I tried to tell you, Jacob," Elias whispered, his voice weak but rational. "He had a silver star. The shadow man had a silver star." Tears streamed down Jacob's face, the first tears Catherine had ever seen him shed. They were hot tears, melting tiny tracks in the frost on his cheeks. He was not just crying for his brother or his father. He was crying for the 10 years he had lost to a lie. The sound of approaching horses broke the moment. A posse from town, led by a panicked-looking Judge Morrison. They had found Blackwood, alive and well, and utterly bewildered by Jacob's nighttime visit. When Jacob didn't return, they feared the worst. They found something far stranger. A bound sheriff, a wounded woman, and a dead man who wasn't dead at all. The conspiracy unraveled quickly after that. Burke, faced with Elias's testimony and Catherine's account, confessed everything. He hadn't acted alone. Judge Morrison, it turned out, was his partner. They had been systematically running ranchers off their land for years, using intimidation, forged documents, and, when necessary, murder. They killed Jacob's father for the water rights, knowing Blackwood would be the obvious suspect, creating a feud that would keep anyone from looking too closely at them. The whole town had been their chessboard. As Burke and the judge were led away in chains by the stunned deputies, the townspeople gathered around the Double T, their faces a mixture of awe and shame. They had whispered about the crazy, haunted Thornfield boy for years, never knowing the truth of the burden he carried. In the middle of it all, Catherine stood beside Jacob. The contract, the rules, the cold arrangement. It all felt like a lifetime ago. They weren't partners in a lie anymore. They were survivors of the truth. Jacob turned to her, his gray eyes clear for the first time. The storm in them was gone. I asked you to be my wife, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I never deserved you. You saved us, Catherine. You saved my brother. You saved me from myself. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. It was worn and faded. I bought this a week after our wedding, he said. I told myself it was for when it was all over, a final piece of the charade. He opened the box. Inside was a delicate gold ring, set with a small, perfect diamond. It glittered in the bright morning sun. But it's not a charade, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Not anymore. He took her hand, the one with the simple, cold band, and slid the diamond ring onto her finger beside it. Catherine Thornfield, he said, his eyes locking with hers. I am not a man who knows many things for sure. But I know this, I love you. Not because of a contract, not because I needed an alibi, but because you have a spirit that cannot be broken. You walked into my hell and brought back the light. Tears she didn't know she had left to cry welled in her eyes. I love you, Jacob, she whispered, more than I ever thought possible. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't the cold brush of a stranger or the desperate act of a man falling apart. It was a kiss of truth, of promise, a new beginning forged in the wreckage of the past. A few feet away, Dr. Whitman was helping Elias to his feet. The young man was weak, but his eyes were clear. He looked at the mountains, at the sun on the snow, as if seeing them for the first time in a decade. He then looked at Jacob and Catherine, a soft, genuine smile gracing his lips. The long winter was finally over. The prophecy had come true. A man's spirit, broken by grief and lies, had finally been set free. Not by vengeance, but by the stubborn, unbreakable courage of a woman who refused to be a pawn in anyone's game. They had a long road ahead. Healing Elias's mind would take time. Rebuilding the double T from a house of secrets into a home would take work. But as Catherine stood there, her hand in Jacob's, she looked out over the vast white prairie. It was no longer an empty, lonely place. It was full of promise, a legacy not of revenge, but of redemption. And in the distance, the mountains stood guard, eternal witnesses to the truth that sometimes the most practical arrangements, the most desperate contracts, can bloom into the most extraordinary love stories. This story is a powerful reminder that the deepest secrets often hide the most painful truths. The journey of Catherine and Jacob shows that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about fighting for what's right even when you're terrified. What did you think of the final twist with Sheriff Burke? Did you see it coming? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more tales of secrets, survival, and justice, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.